Thank you so much. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and I'm going to talk a lot about the bailout, if that's okay. Let's not hear it for the bailout. The trillion-dollar crime scene, the $700 billion stick-up. I'm just looking at how much time we have. There's a lot to say about the bailout. The shock doctrine is an alternative history of how we ended up with this Wild West brand of capitalism, what the French call savage capitalism, this no-rules, so-called free market that is imploding so spectacularly before our eyes. We have been sold a fairy tale version of history that tells us that this way of organizing societies that has really been a liberation movement for capital, liberating itself from all the barriers to the accumulation of obscene profits. That's really the history that we've been living, this counter-revolution against the New Deal. We're told that this swept the world peacefully and democratically because people wanted these policies of privatization, of deregulation, of deep cuts to social spending. What I'm arguing in the shock doctrine is that we cannot understand how this very unpopular ideology triumphed around the world without understanding the role that crisis has played at every turn, the role that shocks play at every turn. And that's what I mean by the shock doctrine. What I mean by the shock doctrine is a political strategy that is deeply understood at the highest reaches of power, and it is high time that regular people understood this strategy as well. And by the way, I think that we're catching on, as Ham alluded to. And that strategy is that if you have a set of very unpopular policies that benefit the elites but don't benefit regular people, then the only time you can push through this ideology in the way that economists describe as economic shock therapy, pushing it through all at once. I'm not talking about the gradual approach. I'm talking about the Big Bang moment, the moments when you get it all through at once, like Thatcher's Britain, like Russia, in the midst of the economic crisis in the 90s. You need a crisis, because a crisis creates a state of emergency. When we are in a state of shock, we regress, we become childlike, we start thinking, oh, I don't know, that Rudy Giuliani is our daddy and he's going to take care of us, and that really Henry Paulson is looking after us and we can trust him. That's what I mean by the shock doctrine. And there is a window of opportunity that opens up in the midst of crisis when we are panicked, when we are focused on daily emergencies, when it is possible to push through these policies without debate. So this strategy is a democracy avoidance strategy. It is a way to get around democracy, even if you happen to live in a democracy, even if you happen to live in an electoral democracy. So what I do in the book is I trace the various kinds of shocks, the various kinds of crises that have played this enabling role since this ideology began spreading throughout the world. It didn't begin with Reagan and Thatcher. It began with Pinochet in the 70s. Pinochet's Chile was the first laboratory for Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys, the first place to privatize Social Security, the first place to introduce a flat tax, policies that the Republican Party in this country has yet to find a crisis big enough to be able to exploit, although they are still trying on their way out the door. So in the 70s, they didn't have to find their way around democracy. They just overthrew democracies in Uruguay, in Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil. And in the aftermath of those shocks, they pushed through these radical policies, and they got rid of the opponents of those policies with very real shocks to their bodies. And all of these three shocks, the shocks to countries, the shocks to economies, and the shocks to bodies, formed a kind of a perfect storm that created that first laboratory for this violent ideology, for this violent market fundamentalist ideology. In the 80s, it was the debt shock. It was the economic crisis that forced countries in a state of panic, in a state of desperation, to go to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and meet the market fundamentalists there who said, you're in some trouble? You've got a market crisis. Well, we're not going to bail you out exactly. We might give you a loan, but attached to that loan is a whole set of measures, like privatizing your phone system, your electricity system, your oil, your water, your roads. Oh, and you're going to have to cut back. You're going to have to cut funding to education, introduce school fees and health care. This is also a violent process. This was the so-called peaceful period. I also look at the role that economic transitions, rapid-fire political change, changes from one regime to the next. And sometimes it can be a happy transition, like the end of apartheid or the collapse of communism. But it creates a period of such profound change, such profound dislocation, that it is possible to push through very rapid change all at once. And I wrote this book because I had the experience of living in a country that had experienced one of these very rapid political transitions in the 80s, Argentina. This was one of the first laboratories for this ideology. But what most interested me about what had happened in Argentina is that when the dictatorship ended and democracy came, in that period, everyone was focused on the big P politics, on the fact that they could finally vote, on the fact that they were closing the torture centers. And what I heard from so many of my friends in Argentina was that they felt that they had missed something in that political transition, that they had missed the economic side of it. And so they had been able to overthrow the political regime, but the economic system that had been imposed with so much violence remained intact. And then I went to South Africa and I spent some time there, and I met a lot of people who told me the same thing about the transition in South Africa when they finally overthrew apartheid and had a democratically elected government that brought Nelson Mandela to power in 1994. I spoke to many wonderful South African journalists, a third-generation ANCer investigative journalist named William Gomede, who said this thing to me that really resonated with me. He said, "We missed it." And what he was talking about was the way in which the economic system of apartheid managed to pass itself on, even under democracy. He said, "We missed it." And that reminded me of something I heard in Argentina about what they had missed in their period of rapid change, of their political transition. Because, of course, the liberation movement in South Africa wasn't just about the right to vote and the right to freedom of speech for all people and freedom of movement. It was about the fact that apartheid was an economic system as well as a political system which had dramatically concentrated wealth in the hands of the white elite. And part of the promise of liberation was the redistribution, that nasty word, of those ill-gotten gains. And that was the platform, the economic platform of the ANC. That's the election they ran on in 1994. But in the key transition period, they locked in several of the key figures, like the head of the central bank and the finance minister. That was part of the deal when they handed over power and they agreed to have elections. The outgoing apartheid government said, we want to keep our apartheid-era central banker and our apartheid-era finance minister in your new democracy. This is one of the great untold stories, right? In Argentina, the elected Peronist government of Carlos Menem, who came to power as a man of the people, vindicating the crimes of the past, he appointed the head of the central bank from the dictatorship, a man named Domingo Cavallo. Any Latin Americans in the crowd, they know that name. Domingo Cavallo was made famous because his last act as central banker, as head of the central bank under the dictatorship, was to nationalize the debts of the largest corporations in Argentina, including the multinationals like Citibank, like Ford, like IBM. It was the parting gift. Sound familiar? We'll take your debts. You can keep the profits. Well, to reassure the markets during the debt crisis in the late 80s, Menem appointed Cavallo, and the market cheered. A 30% increase in the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange, applauding the return. They call it economic continuity. Be careful of people talking about smooth transitions from corrupt regimes. If you want change, if you vote for change, you're going to have some rocky moments along the way. There is no way to transition from a corrupt regime marked by illegality, marked by methods that we have rejected, like torture, and not have a few bumps along the way. Somehow we have accepted this idea that you can vote for change, but then you can have a smooth, seamless transition that won't alarm the market, that won't alarm anyone. That's how you get the status quo, because the market votes for the status quo. It doesn't want change. And people have just voted for change. And there is no way to reconcile those two forces without accepting that it's going to be rocky. Now, I wrote this book because this strategy of exploiting these moments of disorientation, the moments when we're all focused on big P politics, on who's getting the top appointments, on what was said in the latest speech, on the pageantry of politics, that we don't read the fine print. You know, that strategy only works if we don't know it's a strategy. If we don't know it is a strategy. If we know it's a strategy, it stops working, because the whole thing is about exploiting our disorientation, exploiting our regression. So, the bailout. Well, you know, colonial rulers, European colonial rulers had this habit when they finally realized they had to hand over power to the indigenous population, they would loot the treasury on the way out the door. The Portuguese in Mozambique poured cement down the elevator shafts. They were particularly vindictive. I think that this bailout should be understood as the Bush administration's final pillage. That is actually what we're seeing here. And it goes well beyond the $700 billion, and it's far more than $700 billion when you count Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And when you count the loans that are being handed out with no accountability, that's up to $2 trillion. We're talking multi-trillion dollars here. And it goes beyond that, because after they finish looting the treasury, then the real crisis begins. And that's the crisis in the public books. That's the transfer of a private economic crisis, a private sector crisis, to the public sector. And then all the things that people have been saying, yes, we can about, yes, we can have alternative energy, yes, we can have health care for all Americans, then it becomes, in an instant, no, we can't. Sorry, we can't afford it. We've just spent all the money. We don't have any money left, right? So all the people who've been selling this bailout then become the naysayers. So think about it as Republican insurance against the promise of real political change in this country. It only works if we don't know about it, if we don't understand that this is a tactic. Now, think about that original 3-page ransom note that Henry Paulson presented the country with, right? It, incredibly included this clause that said explicitly that Treasury would be given $700 billion to do with what it liked, and that the decisions made under the bailout could not be challenged by any arm of government and by any court of law. Remember that? Remember that? You know, and in some ways this gives me hope, because people recognized this pattern in that moment, right? It was a moment of pattern recognition. We called it the Economic Patriot Act, right? We said, haven't we seen this before? A moment of crisis, and they rammed through this legislation. You know, the real mistake that they made was how short it was. The Patriot Act was really long. People didn't read it until it was too late. This was 3 pages, and everyone read it. Everyone read it but John McCain. And they linked to it, and they blogged about it, and they said no. And the part of it that was most controversial was the lack of oversight, was this idea of the idea of a blank check. So in order to get the bailout passed, it had to be pretty significantly reworked, and we were all reassured now that there were all kinds of checks and balances in place, that there were going to be all of these people doing oversight, that they weren't going to be able to do whatever they wanted. Now, a month and a half later, we find out that while Treasury has been extremely efficient in handing out $290 billion already to the banks in these equity deals and to AIG, they have so far not made any of the key oversight appointments. In other words, all this time, nobody has been watching the store. But I think what's also important to understand is that Paulson has achieved by stealth, by what they call incompetence, all right? Exactly what he originally tried to do explicitly, which is whatever he wanted, okay, with no oversight whatsoever. Now, this is important to understand for a couple of reasons, and they're not just handing out these equity deals to the banks. You know, the specialty of the Bush administration, and this is where, you know, mine and Jeremy's work has really intersected very strongly, has been setting themselves very ambitious goals and then hiring other people to do their jobs for them, right? These are the outsourcers in chief. They have created a hollow shell where the government used to be. It still looks like a government, still, you know, they still play a government on TV, but every part of you know, what we consider core government services has been outsourced, right? And Blackwater, of course, is the ultimate example and the most frightening example of this. They've run the bailout in exactly the same way. They announced this, and it is the new trough. After Homeland Security and Iraq, the entire thing is being run by private accounting firms and by the same banks and the same Wall Street law firms that got us into this mess. So I'm just going to tell you about one contract that was handed out to a law firm to advise the Treasury about these equity deals that they negotiated with the banks, okay, which they were calling nationalization. And I think we got that wrong. I don't think it's Treasury that nationalized the banks. I think it's the banks that privatized Treasury. So you know, this is, I don't really even understand why they needed to outsource this part of the job, because if there's one thing they have at Treasury, it's former Goldman Sachs executives who know how to, you know, presumably know how to make these deals. That's all they know how to do. Nonetheless, they felt they needed to hand out a contract to a law firm to give them advice on these deals. The firm that got the deal is called Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett. The first test for the bailout was that meeting that Henry Paulson had with the 9 CEOs of the largest banks in the country. And they announced in 1 hour that Paulson had strong-armed these banks into accepting $150 billion of taxpayer money. He's so tough, right? Well, so this was Simpson Bartlett Thatcher's first gig, okay, this deal. Now, what was interesting when I started looking into this one company, I wrote a piece about it for Rolling Stone. You can read it on their website or on my website. Simpson Bartlett Thatcher has represented 7 of those 9 banks. 7 of those 9 banks, okay? They are the quintessential Wall Street law firm. They've negotiated some of the biggest bank mergers in recent times. And maybe we could say, well, we want the best, you know, we want the best deal makers available. Well, here's the problem, right? Taxpayers represent a fraction of the business that these banks represent to Simpson, Bartlett, and Thatcher. And the deal that they helped Treasury negotiate, as we now know, is an extremely bad deal. Now, we were told that they were doing this, that they were injecting, you know, $25 billion in some banks, $10 billion in others, in order to address the credit crunch, in order to get money flowing, lending flowing, right? Well, the first rule in deal making is get it in writing, okay? Gordon Brown, 5 days earlier, negotiated a deal with British banks. He got 15% dividends for British taxpayers. He got seats on the board, voting rights, and he got it in writing that they had to spend the money that he was injecting, that they were injecting, on loans to small businesses and taxpayers. So what did Paulson, the tough guy, and their Wall Street law firm get? They got 5% as opposed to 15%, no voting rights, no seats on the board, and they didn't get it in writing that they were supposed to start lending. So lo and behold, the banks decided not to. They decided to pay it out to their shareholders, to pay it in salaries, to pay it in bonuses, and to start buying other banks, which will turn around and say, when they get into trouble, that they're too big to fail, and we have to bail them out, too. Now, this may very well be illegal. A lot of what we're finding out now is that this is illegal. And you know, we also have found out recently that they've slipped in $140 billion tax windfall to encourage these mergers. So that's money out of the pocket of the US government. And to put that in perspective, Barack Obama's alternative energy program is $150 billion, okay? Just that tax windfall is pretty much the same amount as the alternative energy program. The health care program is half as much. Okay, so remember that when we hear no, we can't about all the things that have been demanded and voted for in this country. I'm not going to talk about Treasury, except to say that I think Larry Summers is more of the same. He's one of the people who got us into this mess, and it's this same logic that you have to sort of coddle this market that has this sort of personality of an ill-tempered 2-year-old who throws a temper tantrum when anything gets taken away or changed. This is not a market that needs to be coddled. Barack Obama won this election by telling the American people something that was true, which is that this market failure is the failure of an ideology. It's the failure of the mania for deregulation. It is the failure of the idea that you give more and more to the people at the top and it trickles down to people at the bottom. You know, Larry Summers is somebody who wrote the rules that created this mess. He was Treasury Secretary under Clinton. You know, and we all told it. We listened to Obama say, "This is, you know, the culmination of 8 years of deregulation." No, no, no. It was not just 8 years. Glass-Steagall, which was the law that prevented investment banks from being in the same business as commercial banks, that was eliminated in 1999 when Larry Summers was Treasury Secretary. He introduced Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton signed that piece of legislation that more than any other created this crisis. He also was side by side with Alan Greenspan when they fought to keep derivatives from being in the reach of government regulators. Okay, so if you want change, if we really want change, it actually does require doing things that say there's a new sheriff in town. And the market will react badly, and then it will recover. The good news is that we're a little bit used to these shocks. They're a little bit less shocking. And I actually think there is a moment when it is possible to make good on some of these promises. The closer you are to the election where the promises are made, the easier it is to do. You know, we're hearing a lot about this idea that we might get a New Deal, a New Deal or a Green New Deal, and that Obama is maybe the next FDR. You know, we subscribe, unfortunately, I think, to this great man theory of history, which tells us that FDR handed the New Deal to us from on high because he was so enlightened, right? And we erase from so much of our history, from so much of the way we tell ourselves how we arrived here, this incredible struggle from below that forced FDR to introduce the New Deal and that allowed him to sell the New Deal to the elites in this country as a compromise, because the alternative for a while there looked like revolution. And, you know, Obama has said many, many times that he needs this incredible movement that brought him to power to stay mobilized. And, you know, FDR used to say when people presented him with a piece of progressive legislation, "Go out there and make me do it." I think that is the best gift that this president could be given, is a population that stays mobilized, that doesn't just go home and say, "Okay, we won," and relax, that keeps reading the fine print, that demands the change, that reminds the Republicans that they lost. And, you know, I think of this as the antithesis of what I'm calling disaster capitalism and the shock doctrine, which is the exploiting of crisis to get around democracy, to avoid democracy. We can use crisis to enlarge democracy so that it isn't something that just happens every few years, so that it isn't a spectator sport. And so I think the disaster capitalists have had the reign for a long time now, and it's time for some disaster collectivism. Thank you.
Now I have to go ahead and say something after this. It's touche, Ms. Klein. You know, last time we were here together in Miami, I believe, was during the FTAA summit, where we were hardly in these kinds of, are you cheering for the FTAA or for those of us who are in the streets protesting against the FTAA? This is a much nicer venue. There's no tear gas or rubber bullets being fired yet. You know, a lot of times when people come to Miami, you know, if they go to South Beach or something, they're like, oh, there's P. Diddy or there's, you know, LeBron James. Last night, like, Naomi and I were so excited that we were hanging out with Jane Mayer of the New Yorker magazine. We wrote one of the definitive books on the torture apparatus in the White House, and I encourage people to see her later today with Chris Hedges and Layla Alarian and others at 4 o'clock. I want to begin by saying that I'm really honored to be on this stage today with my friend Naomi Klein. She's just an incredible freedom fighter for democratic movements around the world, as well as the movement to democratize the media in this country, and I feel really honored to call her a dear friend. I'm going to begin today by telling a story that sort of, I think, captures much of what has happened in Iraq over the past more than 5 years with the radical privatization of the U.S. war machine. And it's a story that many of you are probably familiar with to one degree or another, but I'm going to talk about some of the details of it, the human side of it that maybe you are not so aware of. And this particular incident happened a little bit after noon on September 16th, 2007. A young Iraqi medical student named Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai was driving in his family's car, running errands with his mother Mahassan, who was a doctor. And they pulled into an intersection in the Mansour district of Baghdad, an area known as Nisr Square. And at the time that Ahmed and his mother pulled into this square, a convoy of 4 heavily armored vehicles was driving the wrong way on a one-way street. And Iraqi police officers scrambled to try to cut off traffic, not to protect the armored vehicles, but to protect Iraqis from getting too close to the armored vehicles, which often have men inside them who shoot at civilians who come too close to them. Well, this young Iraqi medical student didn't stop fast enough for the men in the armored vehicles, and one of the gunmen atop one of those cars fired a bullet and shot Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai in his forehead. That was followed then by more gunfire raining down on the car, and the car exploded with his mother Mahassan inside of it, and she burned to death in that car. That kicked off 15 minutes of sustained gunfire. At the end of it, 17 Iraqi civilians were dead, including women and children. A 9-year-old boy was shot directly in his head when he sat in the back seat of the van that his father was driving, and his father described running to the local hospital because he could still feel his son's heart beating. And when he got there, his son was pronounced dead, and that man went back the next day to gather pieces of his son's skull so he could bury as much of his body as he could find in the Iraqi holy city of Najaf. The men who did the shooting in those armored vehicles were not active duty military, and they weren't members of Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army. They were private forces deployed to Iraq by a for-profit mercenary company called Blackwater. And for many people around the world, that was the first time that they had heard the name of this company, Blackwater. I had been investigating them for a number of years after the killing of 4 of their men in the Iraqi city of Fallujah. I'm sure many of you remember this on March 31st, 2004, when those 4 men were ambushed and killed and burned and dragged through the streets and strung up from a bridge. And the Bush administration used their deaths to justify an all-out assault on the city of Fallujah, killing hundreds of Iraqis, forcing thousands of others from their homes. And in many ways, it was really the day the war turned, because you saw a dramatic escalation in resistance attacks against U.S. Forces around Iraq. You saw Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army rising up, and the Iraqis were on the brink of a semi-unified resistance movement against the United States. And the spark for much of it was this collective punishment of the people of Fallujah in response to the killing of these 4 Blackwater men. And in the papers in the U.S., the drumbeat for revenge was beaten by the press, who described them as civilian contractors. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I always thought of a contractor like my uncle, who installs, air systems in high schools. He's a contractor. He gets hired and he does a job. But civilian contractor, it sounds like they work for the Red Cross, or they're like delivering, aid to Iraqis or building bridges. But these guys were former Navy SEALs, former Army Rangers, working for a for-profit corporation, and they were guarding trucks ultimately on a contract for the largest war contractor, KBR. And so their deaths then were used to spark this massive assault on a city that then resulted in scores of U.S. soldiers being killed. In fact, I was just in San Francisco recently with the Marines Memorial Association and met with a man whose son was killed in the Battle of Fallujah, as many families in this country have relatives who were. The reason I'm bringing up this story and talking about Blackwater is that Blackwater in this context is that there's some breaking news that came down yesterday. We understand that after 14 months of doing absolutely nothing, the Justice Department is now said to be preparing draft indictments against 6 of the men responsible for the killing that day. They potentially are going to be charged, well, hold off a second, they're potentially going to be charged with manslaughter or assault and could face 5 to 20 years in prison. 20 years in prison for gunning down 17 Iraqi civilians. That's the maximum charge that they could face on the indictment that's being prepared right now. Even if these 6 men, and it could be 3 men, or it could be no men, because it still depends in part on Bush's Justice Department, the least just Justice Department in the history of the United States, to move forward with this prosecution. But even if these guys go down, and even if they're successfully prosecuted, and even if they are convicted, what is it actually going to do to stop this system of radical privatization of the war machine? You see, Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, will still walk around with his cocky look, running this little private army, and he'll pay no price for it. It's always the people lowest down that get hit with the charges. You look at the courts-martial that have taken place in Iraq, I believe that no one above the rank of major has been court-martialed for any crimes in Iraq. It's always the lowest people, the Lindy Englands, the Charles Grainers, the generals who implement the policy, or no, the defense secretary who gives the order for torture, or the secretary of state who covers up the crimes, or deployed these private armies. They never are charged with anything. They're never held accountable for their crimes. You know, when people talk about impeachment, and Nancy Pelosi comes in and she says impeachment is off the table, this isn't just some rhetorical thing that people are protesting about across the country. We're talking about actual crimes that were committed by this administration, and they need to be held accountable. You know, and they say, well, it's not the way things work in Washington, where you get retribution or revenge against the party that just left. We haven't had a president like this before. We haven't had an administration that has committed these widespread crimes in the brazen manner that these men and women have committed these crimes. And I think President Obama should be pressured like all hell to hold them accountable for everything that they've done to this country and the world over the past 8 years. People talk about how the Iraq War was a failure. I mean, now they're talking about the surge. That's a whole myth, and I can talk about that if people want later. The myth that the surge has succeeded in Iraq. They're paying people not to kill American soldiers. That's hardly a successful strategy, but that's for another discussion. Bush, though, has won an almost unimaginable victory with what he has done to the way U.S. wars are waged. We have seen one of the greatest transfers of public money to the private sector in the history of our country over the past 8 years. And they have looted the treasury, but not just taken it and gotten fat off of it and sat somewhere. They've reinvested our money in private corporations who have used our money to build up infrastructure to the point where some of these armed contractors have military forces that could take out a small national government. In Iraq right now, I mean, this is an incredible statistic. In Iraq right now, there are 196,000 people working for for-profit corporations alongside 145,000 U.S. soldiers. These 196,000 individuals work for a network of 630 corporations on the U.S. government payroll. The U.S. spends $2.5 billion a week occupying Iraq. Between 25 and 40 cents on every dollar goes to these for-profit war corporations. They have people who are drawn from 100 countries around the world. In fact, it's probably the most internationalized conflict in the world, and yet I would challenge someone other than a history professor or political scientist or Naomi to name more than 10 countries that have actually been stupid enough to give Bush their troops as cannon fodder in Iraq. It brought down the Spanish government. Britain has almost no presence to speak of. Poland has a handful of troops. You don't have any military or any sovereign nation that was willing to go along with this farce. except for those that were bribed, blackmailed, or cajoled into doing it. And then you have Britain, which is the US poodle, and when Aznar was there in Spain, he was the flea on that poodle. And so you had those three operating the occupation of Iraq. So instead of a coalition of willing nations, Bush and his cronies hired a coalition of billing corporations, and they turned the entire world into their recruiting ground. And so when the nation of Chile says, we're not going to participate in the Iraq war, in fact, we're on the UN Security Council at the time of the vote, and we say no to this, you say, fine, we don't need the Chilean military, we'll just take your soldiers. So Blackwater goes into Chile and hires Chilean soldiers to work for Blackwater on a US government contract in a war zone as a party to a war that their home government is against. It's a subversion of the sovereignty of Chile and of nations around the world, and they've come, as I said, from 100 nations. But in the case of Chile, and Naomi mentioned it briefly, it's particularly perverse because some of the men who were hired by Blackwater were seasoned veterans of the Pinochet era. And the man that Blackwater worked with as a recruiter was a former soldier in Pinochet's military who also was in the US military. He was a dual citizen. That was the man who opened the gateway for the Chileans to go to Iraq, working for Blackwater. And this is how they have changed the face of the US war machine. It's not just about taking our young people and saying to them, if you want a college education, just sign this paper. And next thing you know, you're in Bakuba, Iraq. You thought you were signing up to fight floods as part of the National Guard. Next thing you know, you're in the middle of a war of aggression against the people of Iraq. Now, they turn the entire world into their recruiting ground. The other part of this is the money aspect of it. $2.5 billion a week, 40 cents on the dollar according to Henry Waxman, 25 cents on the dollar according to the Congressional Budget Office report that just came out. This money is then going to these companies like Blackwater, which, as I say, are using it to build up their firepower. Blackwater, over the past decade, from 1998 to 2008, has gotten 90% of its business through the federal government. They are essentially subsidized by us. And yet when Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, was called before Congress, he refused to tell Congress how much money he was making. We pay 90% of Blackwater's bills, and this man has the audacity to stand in front of the top investigative body of the Congress and say, it's a private matter how much money I make. No, Mr. Prince, it's not a private matter when 90% of your money comes from the American people and US taxpayers. But what they have done with this money is to build a parallel infrastructure to the US national security apparatus. One of Blackwater's newest projects is they've created their own CIA called Total Intelligence Solutions. And it is headed by 3 veterans of the Central Intelligence Agency. One of them, and I think the most disturbing person involved with this, is Jake Hofer Black, 30-year veteran of the CIA, cut his teeth working for the CIA in Africa as well as Latin America. This was the man who ran the CIA's counterterrorism center on 9/11, was in charge of the hunt for bin Laden, and was at the center of implementing some of the most brutal and criminal policies of the Bush administration post 9/11. This was the guy who ran the CIA's Extraordinary Rendition Program, the government-sanctioned kidnap and torture program, where people are abducted off the streets of cities around the world, hooded, diapered, shackled, put on a plane and sent to a third country hellhole to be tortured while being questioned with questions often provided by US interrogators to other nations' secret police. He was the guy who stood before Congress and said there's a before 9/11 and an after 9/11, and after 9/11 the gloves come off. He also, as Jane Mayer has revealed, gave orders to his CIA jawbreaker team to literally chop Osama bin Laden's head off, put it on a box with dry ice, and have it shipped back from Afghanistan. Well, that didn't quite work out that way, and he certainly didn't catch Osama bin Laden, although he said, Blackwater executive said recently that when Osama bin Laden is caught, a Blackwater operative will be 50 feet away from him at the time that he's captured. Robert Richer, former deputy director of operations at the CIA, is the #2 man at Total Intelligence Solutions. Enrique Rick Prado, a veteran of the CIA's paramilitary division, a Latin America specialist, is the #3 man at that company. These men, with decades and decades of CIA experience, with extensive knowledge of US covert operations, sensitive national security information, their careers are now on the open market for bidding, not just from foreign governments or the US government, but also from Fortune 500 corporations. In fact, their literature, Total Intelligence Solutions literature, actually targets Fortune 500, and then they expanded it recently to be Fortune 1000 corporations, and they say we can bring CIA-type services to the boardroom. So Blackwater is, in its own words, is like a one-stop shop for the government or for corporations. And Eric Prince says that his company is like the Federal Express of the U.S. national security apparatus. He said, we don't want to replace the post office, but when you really want a package to get somewhere, do you send it through the post office or do you send it by FedEx? He envisions his company as the sort of FedEx of the national security apparatus. They have a maritime division. They just recently deployed one of their 184-foot vessels to the Gulf of Aden to fight pirates. They've been in the news a lot recently. They have an aviation division. They have a domestic operations division. They made $70 million off of Hurricane Katrina. I saw them on the streets of New Orleans when the city, right after the city was flooded, wielding M4 assault rifles, Glock 9 strapped to their legs, telling me that they were there to confront criminals and stop looters. It turns out that Blackwater just simply decided one day to send its forces into New Orleans with no government contract initially. A private man who is a radical right-wing Christian bankroller of the president decides one day he's going to send 184 armed individuals onto the streets of a U.S. city to confront criminals and stop looters. On the 8th day that they were there, it almost sounds like a reverse biblical story. On the 8th day that they were there, they get this no-bid contract from the Department of Homeland Security to be the official bodyguard force for FEMA. Now, I don't know if FEMA has arrived yet in New Orleans, but Blackwater was certainly on the streets of New Orleans, and it was, in the words of one of our colleagues, it was like Baghdad on the bayou, where all of these corporations, and Naomi and I were there together, all these corporations that had made a killing off the killing in Iraq descend on the U.S. Gulf for disaster profiteering. Blackwater started a whole new division of the company out of this for domestic operations because it was so lucrative. Not just the $70 million that they got from U.S. taxpayers, they also hired out their services to wealthy individuals. In fact, they were hardly the only company down there. 180 mercenary companies, private security companies descended on the Gulf. I met Israeli commandos that worked for a company called Instinctive Shooting International, operating, I wish it was funny, operating an armed checkpoint on the streets of New Orleans, and they were hired by a private community. And the private community that hired him, one of the people that was behind flying these men in by helicopter and landing in a park across the street from this gated community, was the guy who told the Wall Street Journal that if the demographics in New Orleans don't change, we, meaning rich white people, are out of here. He's the guy who brought in the Israeli commandos and deployed them on the streets of a U.S. city. The point I'm getting at here is that we are in the midst right now in this country of the most radical privatization agenda in history. Every aspect of our life is being privatized. We see it in schools, where they defund public schools, and then they say, well, the schools are failing, so we need to privatize them. We see it, of course, with the incredible scandal and crime of the healthcare system in this country. We see it in law enforcement, where there's a radical paramilitarization of law enforcement through private training entities. We see it in prisons, where prisons have become a for-profit industry in this country, where some states build prisons to import prisoners as part to boost their economy. And now we see it in a very Frankenstein way with the U.S. war machine in Iraq. So you can say, well, Bush lost in Iraq, or Iraq was a failure. It was an incredible success. They looted the treasury. They built up the private infrastructure of these for-profit companies, and you know what, that they're all going to be on the boards in about 50-something days. You know, where did Dick Cheney, where was he hanging out during the 90s? Well, he was running Halliburton, and he was hanging out at the American Enterprise Institute, and you had Paul Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, all these guys, when they're not in official power, they go to the parallel government and they build up until the next time that they're in power. But what's to stop these guys from freelancing their foreign policy with these companies? What's to stop Chevron, the oil corporation, from just hiring its own little private army and doing what it's always done in Nigeria or elsewhere around the world and raising the stakes on it a little bit more? Why do they even need to bother with U.S. foreign policy anymore? Why can't corporations just have their own policy? And I think we're heading toward that direction in this world. Now, I do want to leave time here for discussion, but I feel like I need to say something about Barack Obama and Blackwater, because conventional wisdom would have it that Obama is going to, aggressively go after Blackwater, is going to shut these guys down, and it's like the clock is ticking for them. I wish that were the case. I will say, in fairness to Barack Obama, that he is the author of the leading legislation in the Senate seeking to bring regulation and oversight to this industry, and he was very much ahead of the curve on this issue. Unfortunately, though, Barack Obama has said publicly that he not only will not sign on to legislation which exists to ban Blackwater and to stop the use of these companies, armed contracting companies in U.S. war zones, but that he cannot and will not rule out using them himself in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. You see, the problem here is that Barack Obama does not have an actual plan to end the occupation of Iraq. His Iraq plan will downsize it and rebrand it, but will sustain a sizable presence of U.S. troops for the foreseeable future. He will keep control of the Green Zone, Baghdad International Airport, and the monstrous U.S. Embassy, which was built in part on slave labor, forced labor. And Obama has written himself into a corner where he is going to need companies like Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and DynCorp to implement his Iraq policy. He also, and I think this is incredibly disturbing, is characterizing Afghanistan as the good war, as many of the Democrats checked their spines at the door during the Democratic National Convention like it was a mink coat. And they're sort of like vegetarians between meals. They're anti-war between elections. You know, I could only find one Congress member, brave old Marcy Kaptur, from Ohio, who represents Joe the plumber's district. I love that Joe, his name isn't Joe, he's not a plumber, and he would have benefited from Obama's tax plan, but, and is threatening to run against Marcy Kaptur for Congress. But Marcy Kaptur spoke out about the Afghanistan policy of Obama, and when I said to her, what would you tell Barack Obama? She said, I would tell him to pick up the phone and call the Russians and ask them what happened in Afghanistan. She was the only Democrat that spoke out against it. Now, we're going to have an escalation in Afghanistan, and it's going to get very, very bad very, very fast. It's going to, I predict that Afghanistan is going to get worse and worse as the U.S. escalation is implemented. Obama credits himself with pushing for more troops and saying that McCain and Bush followed his lead. So we have Iraq, the occupation is not going to end, it's going to be downsized and rebranded. Afghanistan is going to escalate. Obama unfortunately uses the Bush administration and the Clinton administration rhetoric on the war on drugs. He talks about the war on the people of Latin America as though it actually is a war on drugs. It's a counterinsurgency war, and it always has been. Yes, there's narco trafficking. Yes, it needs to be combated. But the U.S. is using the war on drugs to wage a counterinsurgency campaign throughout Latin America, and it's no coincidence that Blackwater is bidding for a share of a $15 billion contract to, quote, fight terrorists with drug trade ties, and a program that could find them operating in Colombia, Bolivia, as well as in Central Asia. Pakistan, when Obama says that he is reserving the right to use unilateral force inside of any sovereign nation's border, I think that should all be a sobering reminder of what the past 8 years have looked like under the Bush administration. He has been posturing aggressively toward Iran, and his statements at AIPAC about Israel-Palestine were, I just think, atrocious. And then you look at the people that he's considering for high posts. Naomi mentioned Larry Summers. Rahm Emanuel. You can't get a more symbolic sense of where this is all going than the selection of Rahm Emanuel as the chief of staff. They are recycling all of the hawks from the Clinton era and bringing them back into the White House. Rahm Emanuel, Richard Holbrooke, Madeleine Albright, Tony Lake, Susan Rice, Hillary Clinton maybe as Secretary of State. Obama had a real chance and has a real chance to build a foreign policy team that is not like the 90s where we had this belligerent policy and the Democrats were sort of out-Republicaning the Republicans. He has a real chance to do it, but unfortunately it seems as though he's bringing back the old guard. And this is what I think needs to be confronted. So in closing, I want to say that I think that in a way we've already had a coup that's taken place in this country. We live now in a corporatist society. The corporations, and we saw this very clearly in the elections and by studying the campaign financing, corporations are in total control. And I like the way that Naomi put it about the banks taking over, not the other way around. But, you know, there was that movie Usual Suspects, and Kevin Spacey has this great line at the end of it where he says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. In many ways, the coup has already happened. And it's up to us to reveal it, to confront it. It's not about being Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative. It's about fighting for what's right in this country. The election is done. Now the fight begins. Thank you.
If you have a question, you may step to the microphone. We have a few minutes for questions.
Quick question. This is for both of you. What, in your opinion, how much leeway do you feel Obama has to make real change in this country?
Look, more than anyone in recent memory, you know, more than anyone since FDR. They have no one to blame but themselves from here on in, they the Democrats, right? Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court's going to be the biggest obstacle. If if they really get serious about change. But it isn't just the fact of controlling Congress and the Senate and the White House. It is the crisis itself and the global demand for change. You know, we talk about this economic crisis and this rejection of this economic model as if it just began a few weeks ago, right? But, you know, thinking about what Jeremy just said, you know, when we were here, when we were last in Miami together during the protests against the free trade area of the Americas, well, think about that, right? I mean, that was a meeting in this city with representative of heads of states from every country in Latin America except for Cuba, who were all signed on, this was 2003, to the idea of creating a free trade agreement that would stretch from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego, 34 heads of state. Is there a politician in the Americas who would publicly endorse the free trade area of the Americas? That's because this economic model is in such profound crisis around the world. And those alternatives are being built in Latin America. They're moving beyond just the critique and actually implementing alternatives to what they call neoliberalism, which is the phrase that they use to describe this economic model, because liberalism means something different in most parts of the world than here. So, you know, I think that he has a lot of leeway born of that international context as well as the national context. Frankly, I think there's no excuse not to move forward. I think this is a once in a, more than generation opportunity. And blowing it would be a terrible tragedy. But the pressure he's under to have the smooth transition, I mean, how quickly did it happen to this celebration of change, this victory for change, but he has to govern from the middle, right? But there has to be, continuity, and we have to bring in people like Larry Summers, who the market trusts, right? And the market trusts him because they know he won't do anything radical, as it were. So that's what we're up against. And I think we should be very suspicious of this fake consensus that is really about undermining what people have just voted for.
I think that we have to, rather than sort of presuming what we think Obama will do, we have to actually look at history, because we have to get away from the cult of personality analysis about Obama, because I think it's much more serious than that. And the White House is never about one individual, as Dick Cheney told us it often is about two people, or just Dick Cheney, or however you want to. But what we have some historical analysis that can be applied to this situation. I talked about in brief about Obama's foreign policy team. The same can be said for the economic team. The various people that are being floated around, we know almost all of these people that are being discussed for cabinet posts, because many of them already have been there and done that, and done it in a way that really was devastating to the world. The 90s laid the groundwork for much of the terrible policy making that happened when Bush was in the White House. The Patriot Act, Clinton laid the groundwork for it. Clinton started the Extraordinary Rendition Program. You had the targeting of Iraq for the entire 8 years of Clinton's presidency, through economic sanctions and bombing. You had the attack on Yugoslavia, the dismantling of that country. But what I'm getting at, the bad politics toward Haiti, is that the people that are now being brought back in have a militaristic view of the world. Vince Harding, who wrote Martin Luther King's speech against the Vietnam War, was saying that this is the issue that separates any comparison of Obama and Martin Luther King, is that Obama accepts that militarism is a solution to world problems, and that's why he will never be a Martin Luther King type figure. And that's Vince Harding was saying the other day. And I find that interesting in the context of the idea that this is somehow an incredibly unusual situation. The Democrats swept Congress in 2006. We saw what they can do when they have power in the Congress, and that is to get an approval rating lower than President Bush. That was Nancy Pelosi's crowning achievement as her time as House Speaker. So I think that the forces that propelled Obama to victory are something to take tremendous hope in. I have met so many incredibly energized people across this country, and I would put my faith in those people and in trying to sustain that movement. If the Democratic Party co-ops social movements and swallows them up, democracy has taken a massive hit in this country. We have a real moment, and I think it's a matter of looking beyond partisan politics and fighting for the direction we want our country to take. So I don't put it as what can Obama do, as much as what can we do, and more importantly, I think, what can we stop from happening?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. our nation used to have a great ethic for justice, for doing the right thing, and everyone gets a fair trial. And yeah, if someone commits a crime, then they should be punished, obviously. We have in the Bush administration a criminal administration, guilty clearly of war crimes, and even John Conyers admits it's not a matter of information, it's just they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
So I was wondering why you think that they are so spineless and unwilling to do justice for the American people.
On the issue of the lack of prosecutions of these private forces that have committed all these war crimes, Blackwater, Triple Canopy, DynCorp, like these corporate forces that have been deployed, there's a complete lack of political will at the Bush Justice Department. Of course, they're not going to prosecute these guys for war crimes, even though they could prosecute them under the War Crimes Act. But then there's also the fact that it would be bad for business, for the war business. If you start going after people for war crimes that are on your payroll working as private soldiers in the war zone, you're going to undermine the whole system of corporate involvement in the war machine. So, I think that those two are related. The idea of the lack of prosecution or investigation of the crimes of this administration and the lack of prosecution of the crimes of these private forces, I think they all ultimately stem from the fact that both of these parties adhere to the same basic rules of the game. And I think that's one of the shameful things about the political system in this country.
It is really interesting that this is coming up so much, and I think in some ways it's the euphoria of the election is wearing off, and we're starting to realize that yeah, they lost the election, but they won a lot, and they're going to get away with it. And there's something really terrifying and terrible about watching people get away with crimes on this scale. And we're really feeling the compromises, because they even got away with it in the campaign itself. I mean, this is part of the winning strategy of running such a safe campaign. How did Obama win this election? Well, one of the ways he won was by giving in on so many important issues that he never gave the Republicans anything that they could really sink their teeth into, and that's why they ended up with Bill Ayers. Because he caved on FISA. They would have had a field day with FISA.
Bill Ayers was against it.
And even something like offshore oil drilling, as soon as it was clear that that was going to be a real difference, Obama gave in. He said he could see certain circumstances where that would be a good idea, just like he gave, and he gave retroactive immunity to the telecoms. That's another example of just people getting away with these crimes.
People talk about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What we need is an actual Truth Commission, and what the Democrats are going to give us is the Reconciliation Commission, and that's the problem.
Thank you.
This bailout is completely consistent with the way the Bush administration has governed. That what we're describing here is a government that really treated the state as an ATM, right? And all of these contractors have just been withdrawing money, not even performing the functions that they said that they were going to perform, like reconstructing Iraq or in Afghanistan, but just paying back the government in campaign contributions. And now the bailout really is, the final trough. And one of the most one of the companies lining up is Giuliani's law firm, and they were, Giuliani was the first to cash in on 9/11, or one of the first. And I have a quote in this recent piece that I did where they say that, this one's really big about the bailout. And so, this is one of the things that we've been looking at is, how each disaster becomes, the new opportunity to just loot the treasury. You had Iraq, you had 9/11, then, Katrina, and the same gang shows up. And we have to understand that this is happening again in real time. But it's actually what they're cleaning up after is the mess they've made of the economy.
Okay. I think we're going to have to end the questions there. I thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Vote on the fact that they were closing the torture centers. And what I heard from so many of my friends in Argentina was that they felt that they had missed something in that political transition, that they had missed the economic side of it. And so they had been able to overthrow the political regime, but the economic system that had been imposed with so much violence remained intact. And then I went to South Africa and I spent some time there, and I met a lot of people who told me the same thing about the transition in South Africa when they finally overthrew apartheid and had a democratically elected government that brought Nelson Mandela to power in 1994. I spoke to many wonderful South African journalists, a third-generation ANC or investigative journalist named William Gomede, who said this thing to me that really resonated with me. He said, "We missed it." And what he was talking about was the way in which the economic system of apartheid managed to pass itself on, even under democracy. He said, "We missed it." And that reminded me of something I heard in Argentina about what they had missed in their period of rapid change, of their political transition. Because, of course, the liberation movement in South Africa wasn't just about the right to vote and the right to freedom of speech for all people and freedom of movement. It was about the fact that apartheid was an economic system as well as a political system which had dramatically concentrated wealth in the hands of the white elite. And part of the promise of liberation was the redistribution, that nasty word, of those ill-gotten gains. And that was the platform, the economic platform of the ANC. That's the election they ran on in 1994. But in the key transition period, they locked in several of the key figures, like the head of the central bank and the finance minister. That was part of the deal when they handed over power and they agreed to have elections. The outgoing apartheid government said, we want to keep our apartheid-era central banker and our apartheid-era finance minister in your new democracy. So in the 70s, they didn't have to find their way around democracy. They just overthrew democracies in Uruguay, in Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil. And in the aftermath of those shocks, they pushed through these radical policies, and they got rid of the opponents of those policies with very real shocks to their bodies. And all of these three shocks, the shocks to countries, the shocks to economies, and the shocks to bodies, formed a kind of a perfect storm that created that first laboratory for this violent ideology, for this violent market fundamentalist ideology. In the 80s, it was the debt shock. It was the economic crisis that forced countries in a state of panic, in a state of desperation, to go to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and meet the market fundamentalists there who said, "You're in some trouble? You've got a market crisis? Well, we're not going to bail you out exactly. We might give you a loan, but attached to that loan is a whole set of measures, like privatizing your phone system, your electricity system, your oil, your water, your roads. Oh, and you're going to have to cut back. You're going to have to cut funding to education, introduce school fees and health care." This is also a violent process. This was the so-called peaceful period. I also look at the role that economic transitions, rapid-fire political change, changes from one regime to the next. And sometimes it can be a happy transition, like the end of apartheid or the collapse of communism. But it creates a period of such profound change, such profound dislocation, that it is possible to push through very rapid change all at once. And I wrote this book because I had the experience of living in a country that had experienced one of these very rapid political transitions in the 80s, Argentina. This was one of the first laboratories for this ideology. But what most interested me about what had happened in Argentina is that when the dictatorship ended and democracy came, in that period, everyone was focused on the big P politics, on the fact that they could find that regular people understood this strategy as well. And by the way, I think that we're catching on, as Ham alluded to. And that strategy is that if you have a set of very unpopular policies that benefit the elites but don't benefit regular people, then the only time you can push through this ideology in the way that economists describe as economic shock therapy, pushing it through all at once. I'm not talking about the gradual approach. I'm talking about the Big Bang moment, the moments when you get it all through at once, like Thatcher's Britain, like Russia, in the midst of the economic crisis in the 90s. You need a crisis, because a crisis creates a state of emergency. When we are in a state of shock, we regress, we become childlike, we start thinking, oh, I don't know, that Rudy Giuliani is our daddy and he's going to take care of us, and that really Henry Paulson is looking after us and we can trust him. That's what I mean by the shock doctrine. And there is a window of opportunity that opens up in the midst of crisis when we are panicked, when we are focused on daily emergencies, when it is possible to push through these policies without debate. So this strategy is a democracy avoidance strategy. It is a way to get around democracy, even if you happen to live in a democracy, even if you happen to live in an electoral democracy. So what I do in the book is I trace the various kinds of shocks, the various kinds of crises that have played this enabling role since this ideology began spreading throughout the world. It didn't begin with Reagan and Thatcher. It began with Pinochet in the 70s. Pinochet's Chile was the first laboratory for Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys, the first place to privatize Social Security, the first place to introduce a flat tax, policies that the Republican Party in this country has yet to find a crisis big enough to be able to exploit, although they are still trying on their way out the door. This is one of the great untold stories, right? In Argentina, the elected Peronist government of Carlos Menem, who came to power as a man of the people, vindicating the crimes of the past, he appointed the head of the central bank from the dictatorship, a man named Domingo Cavallo. Any Latin Americans in the crowd, they know that name. Domingo Cavallo was made famous because his last act as central banker, as head of the central bank under the dictatorship, was to nationalize the debts of the largest corporations in Argentina, including the multinationals like Citibank, like Ford, like IBM. It was the parting gift. Sound familiar? We'll take your debts. You can keep the profits. Well, to reassure the markets during the debt crisis in the late 80s, Menem appointed Cavallo, and the market cheered. A 30% increase in the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange, applauding the return. They call it economic continuity. Be careful of people talking about smooth transitions from corrupt regimes. If you want change, if you vote for change, you're going to have some rocky moments along the way. There is no way to transition from a corrupt regime marked by illegality, marked by methods that we have rejected, like torture, and not have a few bumps along the way. Somehow we have accepted this idea that you can vote for change, but then you can have a smooth, seamless transition that won't alarm the market, that won't alarm anyone. That's how you get the status quo, because the market votes for the status quo. It doesn't want change. And people have just voted for change. And there is no way to reconcile those two forces without accepting that it's going to be rocky. Now, I wrote the book because this strategy of exploiting these Thank you so much. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and I'm going to talk a lot about the bailout, if that's okay. Let's not hear it for the bailout. The trillion-dollar crime scene, the $700 billion stick-up. I'm just looking at how much time we have. There's a lot to say about the bailout. The shock doctrine is an alternative history of how we ended up with this Wild West brand of capitalism, what the French call savage capitalism, this no-rules, so-called free market that is imploding so spectacularly before our eyes. We have been sold a fairy tale version of history that tells us that this way of organizing societies that has really been a liberation movement for capital, liberating itself from all the barriers to the accumulation of obscene profits. That's really the history that we've been living, this counter-revolution against the New Deal. We're told that this swept the world peacefully and democratically because people wanted these policies of privatization, of deregulation, of deep cuts to social spending. What I'm arguing in the shock doctrine is that we cannot understand how this very unpopular ideology triumphed around the world without understanding the role that crisis has played at every turn, the role that shocks play at every turn. And that's what I mean by the shock doctrine. What I mean by the shock doctrine is a political strategy that is deeply understood at the highest reaches of power, and it is high time